Women in Nazi propaganda films occupied a central, carefully constructed space within the ideological universe of the Third Reich, serving as symbols, warnings, and emotional anchors for a national vision that sought total control over German society. From the earliest years of Adolf Hitler's regime, filmmakers, propagandists, and ideologues recognized that female imagery, because of its emotional resonance and cultural familiarity, could deliver messages more subtly and persuasively than militaristic speeches or authoritarian decrees. And this insight shaped an entire cinematic tradition in which women were not merely background figures, but carefully curated embodiments of political myth. As the Nazi state set out to reshape German identity, women in film became tools for articulating racial hierarchy, national destiny, and social discipline. The hardworking farm girl framed within the sunlit fields of the Heimat, the devoted mother bathed in soft lighting as she cradled future Aryan citizens, the efficient wartime helper portrayed with serene stoicism, the alluring but ultimately dangerous foreign woman used to warn against racial mixing, and the demonized Jewish woman presented as a threat to the nation's purity and survival. These films did not offer a unified or monolithic model of womanhood, but instead deployed a series of flexible archetypes that could be adapted to changing political needs, from peacetime mobilization and rural romanticism to wartime sacrifice and ideological hardening. And every archetype was anchored in the broader racial and political logic of National Socialism. Rather than offering an accurate reflection of real German women's lives, these films presented an imagined womanhood that balanced tradition with political utility. A woman who was modern enough to support the war machine, yet traditional enough to embrace Kinder, Küche, Kirche as her core destiny. A woman who participated in the nation's struggle but never claimed public authority. A woman who appeared strong, healthy, and devoted, yet fundamentally subordinate to the male-led racial state. The success of this cinematic strategy depended not only on the content of the films, but on the emotional grammar of Nazi aesthetics: soft lighting, pastoral landscapes, exaggerated contrasts between purity and corruption, and melodramatic storylines that fused private emotions with national duty, so that a woman's personal decisions, romantic attachments, or maternal choices became symbolic acts linked directly to the fate of the Reich. Nazi filmmakers understood that the most effective propaganda did not lecture the audience, but guided them toward identification. And women, because they could evoke sympathy, moral concern, and desire, became ideal vessels for creating emotional alignment with the regime. Thus, films like Die Goldene Stadt, Heimkehr, Wunschkonzert, and countless Heimat productions functioned simultaneously as entertainment, ideological conditioning, and moral instruction. As the war expanded, the portrayal of women shifted from peaceful domesticity to mobilized resilience, yet the underlying narrative remained the same. Women were valuable not for their individuality, but for their symbolic contribution to the Volksgemeinschaft, the racially unified national community. Even depictions of Jewish, Slavic, or communist women served this symbolic function by offering an inverted mirror of the ideal Aryan woman, corrupted, threatening, seductive in a destructive way, or portrayed as parasitic, thereby reinforcing a worldview in which gender and race intersected to construct both the meaning of Germanness and the moral justification for exclusion and annihilation. These cinematic portraits were never passive. They helped shape expectations that governed real women's lives, influencing how they were educated, how they worked, how they loved, and how they imagined their place within the war. Meanwhile, the actresses who embodied these roles often found their careers fused with the regime's agenda, gaining popularity while becoming instruments of ideological performance. After the war, these films and their images of women became objects of scrutiny, condemnation, and historical analysis, revealing not only the manipulative power of totalitarian cinema, but also the complex ways in which gender functioned within fascist cultural production. Post-war memory grappled with the contradiction between the technical artistry of some films and their poisonous ideological core, and the women who appeared on screen were often reinterpreted as symbols of Germany's complicity, victimhood, or cultural amnesia. Ultimately, the study of women in Nazi propaganda films is more than an examination of cinematic technique or gender representation. It is an exploration of how a regime weaponized femininity to build emotional loyalty, create social discipline, justify racial persecution, and mask brutality with beauty, sentiment, and the illusion of moral purpose. These films reveal how authoritarian systems exploit gendered imagery to construct myths of purity, sacrifice, and belonging, and they demonstrate that the portrayal of women, whether idealized or demonized, can become a powerful mechanism for shaping political consciousness and normalizing oppression. In this sense, the female figures who populated Nazi cinema were not merely characters in a story, but integral components of a cultural machinery designed to mold the German imagination, turning personal emotion into political obedience and transforming the intimate spaces of love, family, and motherhood into battlegrounds for ideological conquest. In the ideological architecture of National Socialism, the role of women was crafted not as an independent sphere, but as a carefully engineered component of a broader racial and political project. Nazi ideology imagined society as an organic hierarchy defined by racial purity, biological determinism, and a rigid division of duties based on gender. Women were valorized not for individual ambition or intellectual aspirations, but for their perceived biological function as bearers of the future Aryan race. This construction was presented as natural, eternal, and rooted in ancient Germanic tradition, although in reality it was a modern, propagandistic invention designed to legitimize a totalitarian state and mobilize the populace for its war aims. Propaganda films became one of the most powerful tools in articulating, amplifying, and normalizing these expectations. They visualized a world where women were simultaneously exalted and subordinated, indispensable yet confined, praised yet restricted. Through repeated imagery, narrative structures, and symbolic cues, these films engraved the regime's vision of womanhood into the public consciousness. Central to Nazi ideology was the concept of racial purity, which functioned as the cornerstone of nearly all cultural, social, and political prescriptions. Women were assigned a special role within this racial hierarchy because they were viewed as the biological custodians of the Volksgemeinschaft, the racially unified national community. The purity of the nation depended, in the regime's view, on the purity of women, making them both revered and tightly controlled. Nazi propaganda thus framed women as guardians of heredity and virtue, responsible for producing healthy, racially pure offspring. This intertwined biology with politics, transforming reproduction into a state duty. The state's obsession with birth rates, hereditary health courts, and eugenic policies created an environment in which women's bodies were no longer private but instruments of national policy. Propaganda films reflected this shift by depicting maternity as heroic, nurturing as patriotic, and female self-sacrifice as essential to the nation's survival. A key aspect of the Nazi worldview was the belief in a divinely ordained division of labor between the sexes. Adolf Hitler and other Nazi leaders regularly expressed contempt for the idea of women entering political life, academia, or professional careers. To them, modernity had corrupted gender roles, weakened nations, and destabilized traditional hierarchies. National Socialism presented itself as a corrective force, restoring what it portrayed as natural order. Women belonged in the home, in rural spaces, in community work, or in maternal service to the state. Filmic narratives reinforce this through portrayals of bustling households, contented mothers, loyal wives, and cheerful young maidens participating in state-sponsored organizations like the League of German Girls, BDM. These images communicated that fulfillment could only be found in femininity as defined by the regime: gentle, dutiful, maternal, and racially conscious. The female characters in propaganda films rarely possessed personal goals independent of men or the state. Instead, their journey was one of aligning their identities with the regime's vision. Nazi leadership understood the power of emotional storytelling, particularly in film, to transform ideology into lived experience. Films like Triumph of the Will and Olympia, though not solely about women, established aesthetic principles that were later adapted to shape representations of femininity. Female beauty was idealized in a very specific way: athletic yet modest, youthful yet chaste, robust yet gentle. The Nazi female ideal was both physically strong and symbolically tender, embodying health, racial purity, and moral stability. Propaganda films used soft lighting, pastoral settings, and symmetrical composition to portray women as embodiments of harmony and continuity. Their presence in film was often meant to evoke emotional comfort, national pride, and reassurance. Through these aesthetic choices, femininity became a symbol of the stability, vitality, and sanctity of the German nation. The regime's ideological blueprint for women was also deeply intertwined with its broader racial and colonial ambitions. Women were instrumentalized not only as mothers of future soldiers, but also as cultural transmitters in newly conquered or annexed territories. Propaganda films and newsreels often depicted German women involved in settlement projects, participating in schooling programs, or working in community welfare services that promoted German values in Eastern Europe. These images cultivated a sanitized vision of occupation, masking the violence and displacement that underpinned the regime's expansionist policies. Women were shown as nurturing figures, bringing order and civilization to supposedly backward regions, reinforcing the belief that German rule was benevolent and necessary. This construction not only justified imperial ambitions, but also broadened the ideological expectations placed on women, who were depicted as partners in the racial remaking of Europe. At the same time, Nazi ideology romanticized rural life as the purest expression of the German spirit. Women were frequently shown in agricultural settings, milking cows, tending gardens, celebrating seasonal festivals, symbolizing a harmonious connection to soil and ancestry. This rural femininity was presented as the antidote to urban decadence, cosmopolitanism, and the perceived corruption of modern life. Rural women were framed as the protectors of tradition and simplicity, embodying the timeless virtues the regime sought to restore. In contrast, the regime portrayed intellectual, urban, and politically active women as dangerous or misguided, often associating these traits with the Weimar Republic, liberalism, or foreign influence. Propaganda films thus sharpened the dichotomy between desirable and undesirable womanhood, making clear which identities were acceptable within the national community. Nazi propaganda also constructed womanhood as fundamentally relational. Women existed in relation to men, children, and the nation. Male characters in propaganda films, soldiers, leaders, husbands, farmers, were framed as protectors, decision-makers, and symbols of strength. Women, by contrast, were shown as supporters, nurturers, and moral guides. This division was emphasized visually. Men occupied spaces associated with action, conflict, and authority, while women were placed in domestic interiors, communal settings, or natural landscapes. The ideological blueprint thus extended beyond thematic representation into spatial organization within film. The physical positioning of women on screen reinforced their ideological positioning within society. Even when women appeared in public roles, such as nurses or community workers, their actions were framed as extensions of their maternal nature, rather than as independent professional identities. While the Nazi regime attempted to depict women as universally united under its ideological vision, the actual lived experiences of women in Germany were far more diverse. For working-class women, for instance, often could not afford to conform to the idealized domestic model, particularly as the war progressed and male labor shortages grew. Yet propaganda films ignored these contradictions, constructing an alternate reality in which women effortlessly fulfilled their ideological roles. The carefully curated female world of propaganda operated not as a reflection of society, but as an aspirational image designed to shape behavior. It attempted to close the gap between ideological expectation and everyday experience. By presenting the former as natural, effortless, and culturally celebrated. In this sense, the regime's cinematic portrayal of women served as a psychological instrument, pressuring women to internalize and emulate its ideals. In Nazi propaganda films, the image of the ideal Aryan woman was not merely an aesthetic preference, but a fundamental ideological project. Her appearance, behavior, emotional disposition, and social function were carefully crafted to align with the regime's racial, political, and cultural blueprint. This cinematic archetype served as both a model for German women to emulate and a symbolic representation of the racial future the Third Reich sought to construct. Chapter 2 examines how filmmakers created this imagery, the cinematic tools used to elevate Aryan femininity, and the broader ideological purposes behind these portrayals. Through lighting, costume design, narrative structure, and performance direction, filmmakers transformed women into icons of purity, fertility, discipline, and national loyalty, embedding propaganda seamlessly into popular entertainment. The foundation of the Aryan ideal in cinema rested on carefully curated physical attributes that reflected the regime's racial fantasies. Actresses chosen for key roles typically embodied blonde or light brown hair, blue or light-colored eyes, symmetrical features, and healthy physiques without excessive ornamentation. Their beauty was natural, understated, and devoid of cosmopolitan glamour. The emphasis on simplicity and authenticity reflected the Nazi rejection of urban modernism and its associations with Jewish or foreign influences. In propaganda films, Aryan women often appeared with minimal makeup, modest hairstyles, and clothing that highlighted their connection to nature, domesticity, or rural heritage. This aesthetic ideal reinforced racial essentialism, suggesting that beauty itself was biological proof of virtue and ideological correctness. Cinematic close-ups frequently lingered on female faces, presenting them as embodiments of racial health and moral purity. The emotional and moral qualities assigned to these women were equally significant. Nazi cinema consistently portrayed Aryan women as gentle, loyal, self-sacrificing, and unwaveringly dedicated to family and community. They were serene in the face of adversity, patient during wartime separation, and supportive of male duty. Their emotional steadiness was framed not as weakness, but as a form of strength essential to the stability of the Volksgemeinschaft. Female characters rarely expressed ambition outside the home or questioned social expectations. Instead, they derived fulfillment from nurturing relationships, maintaining tradition, and contributing to collective well-being. Through these portrayals, films sought to naturalize the idea that women's social value lay in their emotional labor and moral steadiness. Such depictions normalized rigid gender roles and framed patriarchal structures as benevolent rather than oppressive. A key component of the ideal Aryan woman was her connection to motherhood, which Nazi propaganda elevated to a sacred national duty. Films frequently depicted mothers as serene, nurturing figures whose love and guidance shaped the next generation of citizens. Pregnant women, infants, and scenes of maternal bonding appeared regularly in cinematic narratives, symbolizing biological continuity and national renewal. Motherhood was framed as both an individual joy and a political responsibility. Women who embraced large families were celebrated as heroes of the homeland, while those who appeared hesitant or ambivalent were portrayed as misguided or influenced by foreign ideas. The regime's demographic goals, expansion of the Aryan population, reduction of infant mortality, and strict racial controls were thus woven into sentimental cinematic depictions. Film served as an emotional bridge between political mandates and intimate personal experiences. Domestic spaces were central settings in these portrayals, reinforcing the idea that the home was the natural sphere of female influence. Kitchens, living rooms, gardens, and rural homesteads served as visual environments where Aryan femininity flourished. These spaces were depicted as orderly, warm, and harmonious, microcosms of the national ideal. Women were shown cooking, cleaning, sewing, or caring for children with a sense of pride and purpose. The domestic sphere, far from being trivialized, was elevated as the foundation of national strength. By romanticizing domestic labor and presenting it as essential to social stability, propaganda films encouraged women to embrace household roles willingly. In doing so, the regime masked the economic and political motivations behind its gender policies, framing them instead as natural expressions of womanhood. Nature played an equally important role in constructing the Aryan feminine ideal. Films often located female characters in pastoral landscapes, fields, forests, mountains, or rivers. These natural settings symbolized purity, rootedness, and connection to ancestral heritage. The rural woman became a recurring figure, strong, wholesome, and uncorrupted by urban modernism. Her movements, walking barefoot in grass, collecting flowers, or tending animals, reinforced the idea that Aryan femininity was inseparable from nature itself. Sunlight, fresh air, and open skies created a visual vocabulary of health and vitality. By contrast, urban settings were associated with corruption, foreign influence, and moral decay. This rural-urban dichotomy was central to Nazi ideology, and film served as one of its most effective vessels. The idealized Aryan woman also played a symbolic role in narratives promoting racial purity and selective marriage. Many films featured plot lines in which female virtue was threatened by ideological outsiders, including Jews, communists, or foreign men. While the explicit demonization of such characters varied depending on the film, the underlying message was consistent. Aryan women must protect themselves and the nation by choosing partners who reflected racial and moral ideals. Marriage was not depicted as a purely emotional union, but as a strategic contribution to the racial health of the nation. Female characters rejected unsuitable suitors, often choosing men who embodied discipline, bravery, and devotion to the homeland. These stories reinforced the political significance of romantic relationships, encouraging women to vie. In Nazi propaganda films, rural women occupied a privileged symbolic role, becoming embodiments of purity, tradition, and the biological continuity of the German nation. This chapter explores how Heimat and agrarian films projected an idealized image of rural femininity that reinforced National Socialist ideology and its racial objectives. Set against rolling hills, quiet villages, and fertile farmland, these films presented rural women as untouched by modernity, cosmopolitan influence, or political agitation. Their lives appeared rooted in timeless rhythms of nature, milking cows at dawn, tending vegetable plots, preparing meals, celebrating folk festivals, and raising healthy children steeped in Germanic tradition. This cinematic world was carefully constructed to represent the countryside as the heart of racial vitality and moral integrity. Rural women, in turn, were positioned as its moral custodians, their chastity, industry, and maternal devotion forming the spiritual foundation of the Volksgemeinschaft. The rural female body became a metaphor for the body of the nation itself, fertile, pure, and threatened by encroaching modernity. Heimat films, though seemingly light and sentimental, were in truth vehicles of political messaging, designed to anchor audiences emotionally to Nazi ideals of gender, race, and belonging. Central to these portrayals was the mythologization of the countryside as the source of the German people's biological strength. The Nazi regime framed the land as a living organism, sacred and inseparable from the concept of Blut und Boden, blood and soil. This ideology held that racial purity and national destiny were inextricably tied to the soil, making rural life not merely a lifestyle, but a biological and cultural imperative. Women, as bearers of future generations, occupied a crucial position within this framework. Propaganda films depicted them as deeply connected to nature, their fertility aligned with the land's fertility. Scenes of women harvesting crops, tending livestock, or nurturing children were not only depictions of daily life, but allegories of racial continuity. The rural mother thus emerged as a heroic figure whose primary mission was to safeguard the future of the German race through motherhood, hard work, and loyalty to tradition. She was presented as the antidote to the perceived degeneration of urban environments, which the regime associated with moral decay, racial mixing, and social instability. Agrarian films often centered on narratives of generational continuity, emphasizing the transmission of values from mothers to daughters. This intergenerational structure reinforced the idea that rural womanhood was not a personal choice but a biological destiny. Female characters rarely possessed ambitions outside marriage, motherhood, and farm life. Their fulfillment derived from their integration into the ceaseless cycle of planting, harvesting, and child-rearing. By portraying rural existence as wholesome and emotionally rewarding, propaganda sought to persuade young women away from urban professions and towards lives of maternal service. Even when female characters faced hardships, poor harvests, family illness, or emotional turmoil, the resolution consistently reaffirmed loyalty to family, village, and land. The message was clear: true happiness was found in rural femininity, unwavering devotion to home, and commitment to racial duty. Visual aesthetics played a crucial role in constructing this ideal. Heimat films employed soft lighting, warm color palettes, and sweeping landscape shots to evoke nostalgia and emotional comfort. Women were framed as part of the natural environment, surrounded by trees, mountains, streams, and fields. Their clothing was simple and traditional: aprons, braids, embroidered blouses, and modest skirts. These visual cues signaled innocence, virtue, and unbroken connection to ancestral heritage. The cinematography often lingered on domestic scenes: young women baking bread, caring for siblings, or participating in folk dances. Such imagery reinforced a romanticized vision of femininity rooted in service, domesticity, and natural beauty. The rural woman emerged not as an individual with internal conflict, but as a symbolic figure embodying the nation's ideals. Notably, Nazi propaganda used the figure of the rural woman as a political contrast to the modern urban woman, who represented everything the regime sought to erase. Urban women were portrayed as frivolous, career-driven, overly fashionable, and disconnected from their biological duty. They symbolized the decadence of the Weimar era, the influence of foreign culture, and the dangers of social liberalism. By contrast, rural women were stable, trustworthy, hardworking, and racially pure. This ideological dichotomy appeared repeatedly in film plots where a naive or misguided young woman left the countryside for the city only to experience moral corruption or emotional emptiness. Her eventual return home served as both narrative closure and ideological affirmation. True purpose could only be found in the traditional, rural setting. Male characters reinforced this lesson, often encouraging women to embrace domestic roles and reject urban modernity. Thus, agrarian films functioned as moral fables masquerading as light entertainment. Throughout these films, motherhood served as the ultimate expression of rural femininity. The portrayal of childbirth and maternal care was sentimentalized, turning motherhood into a near-sacred act. Mothers were shown managing multi-generational households with grace, instilling discipline and warmth in equal measure. Their identity was inseparable from the well-being of children, who represented the future of the Volk. Propaganda films showcased large families with pride, portraying them as harmonious, joyful, and prosperous. Mothers were not simply caregivers, but ideological figures tasked with reproducing the racial future. Their reproductive labor was framed as a heroic contribution to the nation's survival. Even when fathers were absent, serving in the military or lost to war, the mother remained the central pillar of family resilience. Her emotional strength and ability to endure suffering reinforced the regime's expectation that women should sacrifice personal comfort for national duty. The role of young girls in Heimat films further solidified the regime's idealized vision of rural femininity. Adolescents were often shown participating in the League of German Girls, BDM, where they learned physical fitness, domestic skills, and ideological loyalty. Their activities, singing folk songs, hiking, farming, and community volunteering, were designed to cultivate a disciplined and cheerful femininity. Film narratives portrayed BDM girls as innocent and eager to serve, their budding womanhood aligned with their future as mothers. Relationships between young men and women were depicted as modest and chaste, reinforcing the expectation of moral purity. Courtship scenes avoided sensuality, instead emphasizing emotional sincerity, mutual respect, and shared commitment to rural life. The message was unmistakable. Romance must lead to marriage, marriage to family, and family to national renewal. In Nazi wartime propaganda, the portrayal of women underwent a calculated transformation that reflected the shifting social, economic, and military pressures of the Third Reich. Early Nazi ideology had confined women primarily to domestic roles, emphasizing motherhood, racial purity, and household discipline. But as Germany entered a total war that drained manpower and destabilized society, propaganda was forced to reconcile ideological rigidity with practical necessity. The result was a complex and often contradictory image of wartime womanhood. Women were idealized as self-sacrificing nurturers, mobilized as essential laborers, depicted as tireless supporters of soldiers, and framed as patriotic warriors of the home front. Films, newsreels, and state-sponsored shorts crafted a narrative that encouraged women to see their expanded duties not as deviations from traditional gender roles, but as extensions of their natural service to the nation. This ideological reframing allowed the regime to call upon women's labor and emotional resilience while maintaining the illusion that the regime's core values remained intact. Wartime propaganda emphasized sacrifice as a defining characteristic of the ideal German woman. She was expected to surrender personal comfort, emotional needs, and individual ambitions for the greater good of the Volksgemeinschaft. Films depicted women sending their husbands and sons off to war with stoic pride, accepting loneliness and grief as noble contributions to the national struggle. Mothers whose sons died in battle were portrayed as symbols of honor rather than tragedy, their suffering recast as heroic participation in the war effort. This glorification of female sacrifice was reinforced by visual motifs of candles in windows, letters from the front, and solemn ceremonies commemorating fallen soldiers. The effect was to transform private grief into public duty, discouraging dissent or questioning. Through these images, the regime promoted emotional endurance as a feminine responsibility equal in importance to the physical endurance of soldiers. As the war expanded and casualties mounted, propaganda increasingly relied on representations of women as indispensable workers. Initially reluctant to place women in industrial roles, fearing it would undermine the ideological ideal of domestic femininity, the regime eventually faced acute labor shortages. Films and newsreels began depicting women in factories, munitions plants, transportation networks, and agricultural fields. Yet even in these portrayals, the imagery maintained a veneer of femininity, modesty, and cheerful devotion. Women were shown operating machinery with grace, assembling weapons with precision, or working alongside female friends in an atmosphere of camaraderie. Their labor was framed not as labor, but as loving service to their husbands, sons, and the fatherland. By integrating domestic metaphors into depictions of industrial work, such as comparing sewing to assembling aircraft components, propaganda softened the ideological contradictions and reassured audiences that traditional values remained intact. Wartime films also emphasized women's roles as caretakers, not just within the home, but within the broader wartime infrastructure. Nurses, Red Cross volunteers, and community aid workers were portrayed as compassionate guardians of the wounded and displaced. Their work in hospitals, convalescent homes, and military recovery centers was framed as a continuation of maternal care on a national scale. Cinematic depictions highlighted the purity, gentleness, and selflessness of these women, who provided emotional comfort to injured soldiers and maintained morale. This portrayal served multiple purposes. It elevated the social status of caregiving roles, encouraged women to volunteer for state programs, and bolstered support for the war by humanizing its aftermath. Even as hospitals overflowed and conditions deteriorated, propaganda presented an orderly, sanitized image of medical service, obscuring the chaos and suffering that defined the real wartime experience. Another critical dimension of wartime propaganda was the portrayal of women as guardians of home front stability. Scenes of women managing households during food rationing, organizing community drives, tending victory gardens, or caring for children while fathers fought at the front were common in newsreels. These depictions reinforced the idea that women were responsible for maintaining moral and social order during wartime upheaval. The home was framed as a miniature battlefield where women fought through thrift, discipline, and emotional strength. Domestic tasks such as sewing, repairing clothing, preserving food, and managing finances were imbued with national significance. By emphasizing resilience and resourcefulness, propaganda encouraged women to view household challenges as opportunities to demonstrate patriotism. This narrative also provided psychological reassurance, suggesting that ordinary domestic acts contributed directly to military success. Propaganda films also promoted images of romantic loyalty and emotional fidelity, emphasizing that women should remain faithful to absent husbands or fiancés. Storylines often depicted young women resisting temptation, avoiding frivolous socializing, and dedicating themselves to letter writing, prayer, or war-related volunteer work. These themes reinforced moral discipline and discouraged behaviors the regime viewed as threatening to social stability. At the same time, films portrayed idealized reunions between soldiers and their partners, promising emotional reward for perseverance. Such narratives served to maintain morale among both soldiers and civilians, presenting love and loyalty as forces that transcended wartime hardship. As the war turned against Germany and hardships multiplied, propaganda intensified its portrayal of women as emotional anchors for the nation. Films showed women enduring bombings, evacuating children, rebuilding neighborhoods, and maintaining community cohesion. Female characters were glorified as embodiments of quiet strength, capable of bearing fear, hunger, and uncertainty without losing faith in eventual victory. These portrayals masked the breakdown of infrastructure, the trauma of displacement, and the widespread despair gripping German society by presenting an idealized version of wartime femininity. Even in scenes of devastation, women were depicted as calm, disciplined, and unwaveringly committed to the national cause. Late-war propaganda also weaponized motherhood to inspire fearlessness and resolve. Mothers were portrayed as raising children in bomb shelters, reading patriotic stories during air raids, and teaching bravery in the face of destruction. These images served to normalize danger and minimize civilian panic. In reality, urban women bore the brunt of Allied bombings, often struggling to feed their families and find shelter amid ruins. But propaganda films presented motherhood under fire as heroic and almost transcendent, emphasizing emotional fortitude over physical survival. This romanticized vision encouraged women to view their suffering as part of the nation's larger historical destiny. In some films, particularly those produced near the war's end, women were depicted taking on roles traditionally reserved for men, such as firefighting, clearing rubble, or defending neighborhoods. Yet even these portrayals were framed within the ideology of feminine sacrifice rather than empowerment. Women's expanded roles were justified not as signs of social progress, but as temporary necessities demanded by love for the fatherland. The regime continued to insist that once victory was achieved, women would return to their rightful place in domestic life. This assurance allowed propaganda to stretch gender roles without appearing to betray ideological principles. In Nazi propaganda films, representations of women were never neutral. They were meticulously engineered to reflect, reinforce, and intensify the regime's ideological obsessions. Among the darkest and most strategically constructed portrayals were those that positioned women as either victims of Germany's political enemies or as threats whose identities were shaped by anti-Semitic and anti-communist narratives. This chapter examines how Nazi filmmakers weaponized gender to shape public perception of Jews, communists, political dissenters, and foreign populations. Such portrayals did not merely reinforce existing prejudices, they created emotional frameworks through which audiences could interpret state violence, mass persecution, and foreign conquest as morally justified. Women became symbolic vessels through which the regime articulated danger, corruption, moral decay, and existential threat. At the same time, they were also used to evoke empathy, fear, or moral outrage, depending on the narrative needs of the moment. In doing so, propaganda films played a decisive role in normalizing racial hatred and political violence within German society. A central strategy of anti-Semitic propaganda was the weaponization of female vulnerability. Films such as Jude Zeus and Der ewige Jude depicted Jewish men as sexual predators who targeted innocent German women. These narratives were meticulously crafted to evoke fear and disgust, framing Jewish masculinity as inherently corrupt and dangerous, while positioning German women as symbols of racial purity endangered by foreign intrusion. The trope of the threatened woman served a dual purpose. It demonized Jewish men and elevated the protection of German women to a patriotic duty. By presenting the purity of German womanhood as perpetually at risk, propaganda created a moral justification for discriminatory laws, segregation, and ultimately genocide. The emotional power of these narratives lay in their ability to mask state violence as defensive action, transforming racism into a form of chivalry. Anti-Semitic portrayals also targeted Jewish women, who were depicted in drastically different terms than their German counterparts. Jewish women were shown as unattractive, greedy, unfeminine, or morally corrupt. Their portrayal often emphasized exaggerated facial features, poor hygiene, or predatory behavior, reflecting the pseudo-scientific racism that underpinned Nazi ideology. Jewish femininity was framed as antithetical to the ideals of purity, beauty, and order associated with German women. In some films, Jewish women were portrayed as manipulative seductresses who corrupted German men, while in others they were rendered entirely desexualized, their bodies presented as evidence of racial degeneracy. Both portrayals served the regime's broader aim to dehumanize Jewish people and frame them as existential threats to the moral and biological health of the German nation. Nazi propaganda also portrayed women as victims of communism, using their suffering to justify anti-Bolshevik aggression at home and abroad. Films depicted communist societies as chaotic, impoverished, and morally degraded spaces in which women suffered the most, abused by corrupt officials, exploited by criminal networks, or forced into labor under brutal conditions. These images reinforced the narrative that communism destroyed family structures, undermined feminine virtue, and violated natural gender roles. By contrast, German society was shown as orderly, protective, and morally superior. This dichotomy positioned Nazi Germany as a liberating force, whose expansion into Eastern Europe was framed not as conquest, but as rescue. The figure of the endangered or oppressed Eastern woman became a powerful tool in framing German militarism as humanitarian intervention rather than imperial domination. In Nazi propaganda films, love and romance were not neutral themes. They were deliberate tools designed to normalize ideological messages by embedding them within the emotional and familial rhythms of everyday life. While grandiose spectacles, racial narratives, and militaristic imagery dominated much of the regime's propaganda, the quieter portrayals of courtship, marriage, and domestic intimacy often proved even more effective at shaping public consciousness. By presenting Nazism as compatible with and even essential to personal happiness, filmmakers transformed ideology into lived experience. Romance became a narrative vehicle for reinforcing gender expectations, promoting racial purity, and legitimizing the social order the regime sought to impose. The films constructed a vision of everyday life in which emotions aligned seamlessly with duty and private desires merged with national goals. In this chapter, we explore how Nazi cinema used the emotional appeal of love to naturalize the racial and political values at the heart of the regime. As the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of military defeat, internal disintegration, and moral catastrophe, the propagandistic world that Nazi cinema had constructed began to unravel. The carefully engineered portrayals of women as racial ideals, victims, threats, moral anchors, romantic partners, laborers, and symbolic embodiments of the Volksgemeinschaft were suddenly stripped of the ideological framework that had given them meaning. In the immediate aftermath of 1945, these images did not disappear. Instead, they entered a new phase of interpretation, shaped by reconstruction, guilt, denial, cinematic reinvention, academic scrutiny, and the formation of collective memory across generations. Women in Nazi propaganda films became artifacts of a regime that weaponized aesthetics, gender, and emotion in the service of totalitarian control. Their portrayals now serve as a window into the moral distortions of the Nazi worldview and a reminder of the power of cinema to fabricate reality. This chapter examines how these images were interpreted during the collapse of the regime, how they evolved in early post-war memory, and how they have been understood in later historical, cultural, and scholarly frameworks. During the final years of the war, shifts in propaganda reflected the regime's desperation. As defeat became inevitable, films and newsreels increasingly depicted German women as stoic survivors of Allied bombings, exhausted laborers in devastated cities, and heroic figures protecting the remnants of family life amid ruin. These images attempted to reinforce endurance and sacrifice at a moment when the regime could no longer offer hope of victory. At the same time, some propaganda attempted to maintain illusions of normalcy, showing women attending cultural events, engaging in romantic relationships, or participating in festive community life, even as cities burned and millions fled advancing armies. The disconnect between cinematic imagery and lived experience became especially pronounced, revealing the cracks in the regime's ability to sustain ideological coherence through film. In many ways, the collapse of propaganda began before the collapse of the state. With the official defeat of Germany in 1945, Allied authorities banned Nazi films and shut down the propaganda infrastructure. Yet the imagery had permeated the cultural consciousness deeply enough that it could not be erased simply through censorship. Many German civilians, especially women, confronted the painful dissonance between their experiences and the idealized portrayals they had seen on screen. Propagandist depictions of strong, self-sacrificing women clashed with the realities of mass displacement, hunger, sexual violence, and social fragmentation. The contrast between cinematic fantasy and lived suffering served as a powerful reminder of how extensively the regime had manipulated emotion and identity. In this moment, the ideological fiction collapsed, leaving behind a population struggling to reconcile memory and reality. Post-war German cinema played a crucial role in redefining these images. Early films of the Trümmer film era, rubble films, depicted women wandering through destroyed cities, searching for family members, rebuilding shattered homes, and navigating morally ambiguous relationships. This new cinematic landscape rejected the idealized femininity of Nazi propaganda, replacing it with portrayals of trauma, resilience, and moral dislocation. Women became symbols of the nation's brokenness and potential for renewal. Yet even these films sometimes echoed earlier tropes, casting women as stabilizing moral forces whose domestic labor and emotional endurance were essential for national recovery. The rupture with Nazi imagery was incomplete. Some gender expectations persisted, even as the ideological context changed. As Germany moved into the 1950s, interpretations of Nazi-era female imagery became entangled in the politics of silence and selective memory. Public discussions of women's complicity in the regime, their participation in organizations like the NS Frauenschaft, or their role in enforcing racial policies were often avoided. Instead, narratives of female victimhood, air raids, displacement, Soviet occupation became more prominent. These narratives were not inherently false, but they overshadowed more complex and uncomfortable realities. Former propaganda stars, such as those who appeared in Heimat films or nationalist romances, were sometimes allowed to resume careers, while their wartime roles were reframed as apolitical or merely artistic. The cultural memory of female imagery from the Nazi period became fragmented, shaped as much by avoidance as by confrontation. Academic scholarship beginning in the 1960s and 1970s marked a turning point. Historians, film scholars, and feminist theorists began examining Nazi cinema through critical frameworks that exposed its manipulation of gender and emotion. Scholars argued that women in propaganda films were not merely passive representations, but active instruments in constructing a racialized and militarized worldview. They analyzed how portrayals of Aryan motherhood aligned with demographic policies, how romantic narratives disguised racial messaging, how depictions of Jewish and Bolshevik women legitimized violence, and how idealized femininity served the totalitarian project. Through this analytical lens, female imagery became not simply a product of its time, but a case study in how authoritarian regimes exploit gender to shape collective identity. The rediscovery and restoration of many Nazi-era films in later decades added new layers of complexity to public memory. Film festivals, museums, and academic institutions began screening these works under strict contextualization, emphasizing their historical significance rather than artistic merit. Viewers were encouraged to see the films as artifacts of propaganda rather than entertainment. In this setting, female characters were reinterpreted as ideological constructs rather than aspirational figures. Their beauty, suffering, devotion, or villainy were understood in relation to the regime's goals, not as reflections of genuine social values. The distance created by historical reflection allowed audiences to critically examine the mechanisms of emotional manipulation embedded in these portrayals. In contemporary memory culture, women in Nazi propaganda films have come to symbolize both the power of visual media and the vulnerability of societal values to ideological distortion. They serve as reminders of how easily everyday narratives, love, family, duty, friendship, can be co-opted for political ends. Their portrayals revealed the regime's fixation on controlling not only political institutions, but private life, emotion, and identity. In museums, documentaries, and educational materials, these images are now used to illustrate the dangers of authoritarian ideology and the seductive power of sentimental storytelling. They underscore the responsibility of audiences to approach visual media critically, recognizing the potential for manipulation even in stories that appear benign. At the same time, modern scholarship emphasizes the importance of understanding the experiences of real women who lived under the regime. The contrast between propaganda imagery and lived reality highlights how profoundly the regime distorted gender expectations. While films depicted women as racially pure mothers, loyal lovers, or victims of external enemies, real women navigated a complex landscape of coercion, complicity, survival, resistance, and moral compromise. Recognizing this gap is essential for developing a historically grounded understanding of the period. The memory of propaganda imagery must not overshadow the experiences of the people who were subjected to its influence, nor should it be mistaken for an accurate representation of women's roles.